Hey everybody, it's PartyElite here with a beginner's guide to Total War 3 Kingdoms. We're going to start things off with some extremely essential starting tips revolving around the real-time battles of the game. Some of these might already be clear, but most will hopefully provide an extra bit of insight to everyone. The plan is to flesh this beginner's guide out with beginner, intermediate, and eventually advanced concepts, and I definitely recommend checking out my Total War Warhammer guide videos as well. A lot of the concepts in the first several videos still apply, though I will be adapting them for Total War 3 Kingdoms as well. If you have any requests for topics, as always, feel free to leave them in the comments down below. Without any further ado, let's begin with 8 essential battle tips. Fight the Battle of Wills. There are 2 crucial ways of defeating the enemy on the battlefield. The obvious option involves killing each and every one of them, but the faster option involves destroying their will to fight. When you select a unit, this bar here indicates what the currently selected unit's morale is. Hovering over the bar will give you a list of all the current modifiers, positive and negative. Charging, for example, gives units a slight bump in morale, while being charged from the sides or rear gives a great reduction. Keep in mind that Records mode puts a heavier emphasis on morale, especially since it lacks some of the potent morale-boosting abilities that Romance mode generals have access to. Keep in mind also that some units have the Unbreakable trait. This means they will under no circumstances surrender or flee from the battlefield unless explicitly told to do so. Outside of these Unbreakable units, every unit can be convinced to leave the battlefield with a little bit of concentration. Consider all the negative modifiers that can stack: being under ranged fire, losing the current engagement, being charged from the flanks, being charged from the rear, taking a lot of damage at once, being hit by or standing next to fire, standing next to a unit that invokes fear. These are all individual modifiers, and if you pile them onto a unit all together, you will get them to waver, rout, and ultimately shatter. A wavering unit has their icon flashing. A routing unit throws a white flag where its icon once was and might come back to fight again later, but a shattered unit with just a white flag over its head is making its way off the battlefield for good. By fighting this Battle of Wills, you can win a battle quickly without losing too many lives of your own, and you can also use the morale high ground to break through particularly important parts of the enemy, crush a flank, puncture the center, eliminate range support, etc., etc. Use morale as a tool. It is very important, and in my opinion, it's the actual health bar of a unit. Arrows reign supreme. The battlefields of Total War 3 Kingdoms are often littered with corpses well before lines even come close to clashing. Most archers are able to fire at a great range, and with many units lacking range block chance, especially at the early stages of the game, it's like shooting fish in a barrel. Cheap and plentiful archers can be swapped out for superior ranged units when the time comes, typically providing armor-piercing damage and higher base damage, or perhaps providing a higher rate of fire while sacrificing some range. Apart from outright killing people from range, being under fire from arrows will dampen troop morale, making it more likely for them to break, and certain types of missile fire, such as that from repeating crossbows, will actually have a multitude of effects including speed reduction and reduced melee stats. Add these to the fact that morale takes a huge hit when a unit loses a large number of its troops in quick succession, and you've got a simple recipe for success. You'll need 3 to 4 units of archers. Find the enemy unit that is most susceptible to ranged damage. It will either say it outright on their unit card, or you can simply look for the unit with the lowest block chance, then fire a few volleys at them and watch their numbers and will to fight dwindle. Weaken them until they break, or until you feel your own soldiers can just finish them off, and then switch targets. Rinse and repeat. Note also that arrows are actual physical entities, so the larger the target, the easier it is to hit. This means that not only is it easier to hit cavalry, but also that you're more likely to hit something if you fire into a densely packed area. As such, make sure you're keeping an eye out for enemy units using loose formations. They are less likely to get hit, and are as such less than ideal targets. Another thing to keep in mind is that arrows do not discriminate between friend or foe. If you fire into a melee engagement, you will kill your own. To reduce the amount of friendly fire, you should always try to target units that aren't yet engaged with yours, or you can try to maneuver your archers so they have cleaner firing angles into the sides or backs of enemy clumps. Arrows will still get through and hurt your own troops though, so be very careful about your angles of fire. Morale and hit point damage will both affect you just as it does the enemy. Keep an eye as well on the firing arcs of your archers. Sometimes they'll fire from up on high, and sometimes they'll try to shoot straight down. Firing from up on high seems to be less accurate, so you want to be in a position where your archers can fire straight into the enemy, at least while they're trying to close the gaps and charge in. The lower the arc of fire, the more accurate the fire seems to be. Use advanced formations. Whether you're marching forward on the attack, preparing a particularly brutal charge, or holding the line, you will sometimes have access to advanced unit formations that will help bolster your abilities. Keep in mind, however, that these unit formations never come for free. Some will hinder mobility, others will reduce certain stats, and some will make a unit more vulnerable in some ways while protecting it against others. Make sure you keep an eye on these formations and use them as necessary. The benefits they provide are very clearly visible when used correctly. Loose formation must be used when the enemy has many ranged units, or has towers from which they'll snipe your most elite troops with great ease. Unfortunately, the loose formation doesn't hold well against incoming charges, so prepare to turn it off when the enemy gets close. Using the wedge formation is excellent for cutting through enemy lines and devastating their morale and numbers. The turtle formation allows your units to block incoming ranged shots while limiting their movement speed, a worthwhile sacrifice against a range-heavy enemy. There are circles and hollow squares for absorbing or even reflecting incoming charge damage, and then there are the really funky ones for units like the Azure Dragons, where they carry spears and ranged weapons, providing a spears front, archers back formation. Now keep in mind that these formations do take time to get into, and so you have to be very responsive to evolving situations. Don't expect your cavalry to magically get the advantages of the wedge formation just because you clicked it a second before they made impact. Keep an eye out for the enemy using these as well. When activated, a huge icon comes over the enemy's unit icon, letting you know what formation they're about to enter. Do not waste arrows against the 100% missile block chance of the turtle formation. Do not charge blindly into a circle formation, and do not charge headlong into a shield wall. Naturally, these formations are dependent on the units themselves, so they will vary depending on the unit that's being used, and some of the lower tier units don't have access to formations, but in the campaign, having a strategist in your army at level 4 unlocks a lot of advanced formations for the army as a whole. Charge and be charged. It is extremely important to know when and how to charge and when not to. These might sound like basic concepts, but there is a touch of nuance that needs to be addressed. Charging the enemy involves selecting your unit and then, depending on your settings, either single or double right-clicking on a target enemy unit. Do not assume that your troops will automatically charge the enemy. There is no such thing as a move attack order in Total War. You need to give specific attack or charge orders. Charges serve multiple purposes. For one, it can absolutely obliterate an enemy unit, but it also helps with morale. Anytime a unit is told to charge, they get a slight bump to their morale. While it may seem negligible, it can make a world of difference in keeping a wavering unit fighting. Don't hesitate to take advantage of that. Keep in mind also that a good charge needs a good run-up. Your cavalry, for example, can't really charge into the enemy from a few feet away. They also don't get the best charges when rounding corners. Make sure they have a clear path to the target, and make sure there's room to gain speed. When a charge hits, speed and weight both matter. This is why some formations mark out the increased charge speed, because that translates to increased damage output. When a charge finally hits, the charge bonus applies. That's this stat over here. The higher this number, the more damage this unit does during and shortly after a charge. This bonus lasts around 15 or so seconds, though there is typically a pretty sharp fall off. Without seeing the actual hard numbers and mathematics, it feels like this bonus is actually pretty negligible after 10 or so seconds, so that's a good reason to keep sending your cavalry charging from one unit to another. But cavalry aren't the only troops that should charge. Your infantry will have charge bonuses as well, and that slight difference can actually be quite a big difference. If the enemy is coming at you, you should always countercharge their infantry. Help counter their charge bonus. If they're getting it, you should too. Make sure you're not countercharging at enemy cavalry with anything but your own cavalry though. The only time you should charge cavalry is either using your own or when they're tied down and you can charge your spears in to finish the job. Yes, sometimes you'll simply want to stand still and be charged, particularly when it comes to your good against mounted units, or anti-cav units as I'll call them. These units will, when standing still, brace for impact. If you give them a move order, they will unbrace, get to the new location, and then take a few seconds to brace again. When braced, these units can absorb charges coming in from the front, and in some cases, they will reflect that charge damage back to the attacker. Make sure these units are braced when cavalry comes charging in, and of course, make sure the pointy end of the spears are facing the incoming charge. And you should also keep in mind any available advanced formations that might further defend against incoming charges. Similarly, don't always be terrified of charging into enemy anti-cav units with your own cavalry. Be cautious, sure, but if you catch them unbraced, running around, or otherwise engaged, you can come in for a quick charge with your cavalry and leave before they're able to regroup. Fire is powerful. This is a quick one, but fire is extremely powerful. Make sure you unlock and bring fire arrows and fiery ammunition to the field, and make sure you use it appropriately. Fiery ammunition is typically slower to shoot and less accurate, but it can do three very important things. For one, they can start fires. Firing fire arrows onto trees or buildings will have a chance of starting a fire. Trees are set alight rather easily, and buildings will take fire damage. When that fire damage reaches 50%, it typically continues upward on its own pretty quickly, and when it reaches 100%, the building is set alight, and it starts to take proper damage until it is completely destroyed. 2, this kind of ties into the first one, I think maybe I'm cheating here, but the fire itself can spread among trees and other buildings, potentially taking out entire sections of forest, multiple towers, and crucial buildings within cities. Then there's 3, it can damage morale. Not only does morale take a hit when a unit is under fire from flaming ammunition, but when a unit stands next to fire, there is an additional hit to morale. So if an enemy is charging through the forest, you can start to cause some morale damage among them pretty easily. Quick word of advice though, don't overuse fire. Remember, it's slower to shoot, less accurate, and as a result, it causes less damage. It is a completely viable and perhaps even preferable tactic to use fire arrows and fire ammunition as an occasional shot. In the case of setting buildings and trees alight, use fire arrows until the job is done, by all means. But against enemy units, you'll notice that the morale damage from fire arrows lasts a little while, so you can get a volley of fire in, and then switch for a round of the more lethal regular shots, and then switch back to fire for another volley when the initial effect has worn off. Rinse and repeat. This will ensure you're maximizing damage to morale and to health, which in turn will help maximize your ammunition. Take your time. It is very easy to rush into combat, to feel confident in your numbers, and to feel a bit of impatience. But if you take your time to plan your approach, you can often get away having taken less damage than you otherwise would have. This is particularly important for crucial campaign battles where you can't afford to lose too many troops. For one, especially in records mode, running around everywhere tires your troops out, and tired troops move more slowly and perform a lot worse. This isn't as big a deal in romance mode, but why fight tired if you don't have to? It does have an effect. Apart from that, looking around the map will often give you some ideas in terms of your approach. Units can hide among trees or tuck behind hills to stay safe from enemy lines of sight. Sneaking will allow you to set up ambushes or sneak up to towers or archers without being completely destroyed on the approach. One of my favorite things to do is for siege battles. If it's a city with walls and I have trebuchet, I'll plan my approach to make sure I have to go through the least amount of tower arrow fire, and then I'll try and destroy the towers that would get in my way. It takes an extra few minutes of hovering over towers to see their firing ranges, but you'll be able to spot potential blind spots, you'll see ideal routes to take, and you'll minimize your losses. Use fire for interior towers, use regular ammunition against walls and towers at the walls, and then make your way in through the predetermined path that you planned out. Again, planning is a very important phase of any battle. General tips. Generals can very easily make or break an entire battle, especially in romance mode where they're basically superhuman and come in with various crazy abilities. In either mode, make sure you're paying attention to the classification of your generals. Avoid using strategists in battle unless it's for the occasional rear charge or for cleaning up the enemy on the route, for example. Make sure the right class of general is being used to engage enemy troops versus engaging enemy generals, and keep in mind that your generals start mounted, but they can be told to dismount if you're particularly worried about a wall of spears. Generals in Romance mode have access to a plethora of abilities, much like advanced formations. Make sure you use these appropriately to help overpower enemy troops and even enemy generals. They can be used in the middle of duels as well, so make sure you supplement your dueling capabilities with your general's abilities. Now, dueling should also be used wisely. Winning a duel means buffs for your army, and killing an enemy general or otherwise getting them to rout causes a big hit to morale for their retinue, unless their troops have the disciplined trait. The hurt to morale applies to records mode as well, so don't be afraid to focus on enemy generals early on in a battle. Generals can also provide a buff to morale of nearby troops, so that's another reason to keep your generals near crucial engagements while also trying to take out enemy generals. They are a key target, they're a high value target, which means you must protect your own and kill the enemies. Rock, paper, scissors. It all boils down to this very simple formula of rock, paper, scissors. Yes, there are exceptions to the rule, but if you're just starting out with Total War battles and some of the more intricate things are overwhelming, if you remember the foundation, rock, paper, scissors logic, you'll do very well. Naturally, it isn't just one layer of rock, paper, scissors at work, but a few intertwined layers. Now, almost every unit has an ideal role and an ideal counter. As long as you can force the enemy to engage with counters while avoiding them yourself, you'll do well. Spears destroy cavalry, including mounted generals in records mode. Cavalry destroys ranged. Ranged destroys... Well, if used properly, ranged units put an end to literally everything that doesn't have shields. Swords are good at countering spears, and axes typically have more damage output and can be used well against spears and swords alike. Keep an eye out for these two stats as well. One denotes armor, the other denotes armor piercing. An armor piercing unit is wasted against an enemy unit that doesn't have armor, and units without armor piercing damage will be more or less useless against heavily armored foes. Make sure you're using armor piercing units against armored enemy units. Don't try to use morale damaging techniques against unbreakable units or generals. In fact, focus these techniques against the particularly weak-willed. Check their morale. If it's low, they're a viable target. More or less everything has a counter behavior, and this hopefully gives you an idea of what to do and what not to do. There is a broad gray area, of course, and there are moments when a glorious cavalry rear charge into enemy spears is well worth the risk. But if you're just starting out, stick to the basics I've mentioned here and get more adventurous as you get more comfortable. I hope this video provided you with some insight you may not have had earlier. There are a lot of complicated topics we can and will discuss in the beginner's guide, but I find it best to make sure the fundamentals are in order first. After all, success depends upon previous preparation, and without such preparation, there is sure to be failure. Learn the basics, make them second nature, and then go for bolder strategies, because that's what being a great general is about. Make sure you subscribe to this channel for more Total War related content, from tutorials to Let's Plays and more. If you have any topics you'd like to see covered in this beginner's guide or any tips of your own, feel free to add them to the comments down below. As always, a massive thanks goes out to all of my patrons and channel members that help keep this channel alive and running smoothly, and a big thanks goes out to all of you for watching. Until next time, cheers.